It's called a grief doll, Dr. Ramos said. I stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "Eh, what?" I asked. I'd agreed to the session to get my mother off my back. Provided, of course, that she also foot the bill. And, truth be told, it hadn't been an easy couple of months. The word stillbirth sounds a lot more peaceful than the reality of it all. You get all the same blood and screaming as a regular birth, but with none of the joy afterward. Things are, I guess, still, in a way. The silence of the grave. I know it's a little unconventional, Dr. Ramos said. But, there's been some really solid research to back it up recently. My colleague down in Camden. I cut him off. "You want me to buy a life-sized recreation of the dead baby that I just gave birth to?" He looked slightly chastened by this. "I want you to process what happened, Mary. It can help. Look, if what you were already doing was working, you wouldn't be coming here, right?" I sighed. "All right. You're the doctor. Who am I to argue with science?" We talked a bit more after that, but it's not really worth recounting here. The next day I went to the address Dr. Ramos had texted me. It was a little building tucked away downtown between the huge tech skyscrapers and offices. When I walked in, the owner, a short man with a scruffy beard, smiled at me and said, "You must be Mary." I nodded. "Would you like to sit down? Do you want anything to drink? Anything to eat?" I shook my head. "I don't really want to stay here any longer than I have to, if that's all right with you," I said to the Rasputin-looking gentleman sitting behind the desk. "I get it," he said, nodding gravely. "People come here to get away from something, not to settle down. Do you have the pictures?" I took them out of my bag. It had been quite a while since I'd needed to get photographs printed out. Ever since the world had gone digital, we've all become allergic to paper. "Here they are," I said to him. "These would serve as the model for the doll." He reached out and took them from me, examining them carefully. "I think I've got what I need. I will let you know if I need anything more," he said, stroking his long beard hypnotically. I left and drove home. It was a quiet ride. Much more quiet than I'd been used to. Ever since Tim had left, there were these little dead spaces throughout the day. He used to fill car rides with excited chatter about protons and leptons and all the ons he got to work with as a physicist. My brain had begun to fill these spaces with grim reflections on the past and future. "It's your fault. You don't deserve a baby. This is God's way of telling you that you don't deserve to be alive." Over and over again these thoughts would run through my mind like the world's most depressing tape recorder. Vicious, hateful, unbelievable things kept popping into my head as I drove the short distance home, making the trip feel far longer than it actually was. I had taken to staring at the ceiling and crying myself to sleep most nights. The big, empty house felt suffocating at 3 a.m., like all the open space was sucking the air out of my lungs every time I opened my mouth. This had been the way I spent most nights since the stillbirth. I tried to fill the silence any way I could. At all hours of the night, one could hear my TV blaring or my phone playing some podcast or another. Anything to avoid the little dead spaces between one task and the next. But it was most difficult of all when I tried to sleep. I saw images of my little girl when I closed my eyes. I saw the blood and heard my own screams when it became clear that she would never take a breath. There were also subtler forms of self-inflicted torture. Exactly 1 month after the worst day of my life, I came home from work to find Tim's things cleaned out and a note on the kitchen table. It read, "I'm sorry, Mary. I can't imagine how hard this month has been for you, but every day I stay here is like a knife to the heart. You're just so sad and I can't take it anymore." That phrase, "you're just so sad," played in a loop in my mind's ear. Eventually, I won the battle against consciousness. It was a fitful, restless sleep pregnant with terrible things. I felt like I'd lived an entire life come morning. I dreamt that I'd held little Sarah in my hands, that I'd been able to feed her from my own body just like I'd wanted to do for so many years. But as I held her against my chest, she melted into a puddle of flesh and blood, yet never ceased to suck, to draw whatever life she could from me, and I was desperate to give it to her. Eventually, she was little more than eyes in a puddle of fleshy blood, staring at me from the ground and whispering, "Why didn't you save me, Mama?" I woke with a start. Never, not once in my life, had I experienced a dream like this. I sat huddled in my bed sheets, shaking with tears as I saw the image of my melted little girl swirling around on the floor, asking why I hadn't helped her. Reality seeped back in stages, penetrating the veil of sadness, and shocking me to my feet with the blaring intensity of my phone's alarm. It was always turned up to full volume because anything lower risked my sleep-addled mind resisting its call to return from the deep. It had always been difficult to tear myself from the land of dreams, and more so after my life began to feel like a nightmare. But lately, sleep offered little respite. I pulled on my clothes, brushed my hair so that it was halfway presentable, and poured myself a bowl of oatmeal. It was a gray, soggy pile at the bottom of my bowl. In a flash of unwanted connection, my brain superimposed the image of little melted Sarah onto my field of view. I nearly vomited into my bowl, but just then there was a knock on my door. "Package," the deep baritone on the other end intoned. I opened the door and saw the mailman walking away. It occurred to me that nothing was stopping me from asking him out now that Tim had wandered out of my life. But, immediately, my brain stepped in to fill in the blanks. Why would he want someone like you? What the hell is wrong with you? I don't even want you and I am you. These thoughts came as easily as my breath, and I had long since stopped trying to challenge them. In all likelihood, they were right. I picked up the package and saw that it was the grief doll. As soon as I got home from work, I'd figure out what the hell I was supposed to do with the thing. As I stepped into the bathroom, the mirror joined my inner voice in confirming my lack of romantic prospects. Deep, black circles formed rings under my eyes. Deeper wrinkles stood out on my forehead and my double chin, and was that a gray hair? Already. Immediately, the thoughts returned. You'll be dead at 50 by this rate. The world won't miss you. Why not make it tomorrow? Again, these suggestions were difficult to challenge with the evidence inches from my eyes. It was hard to care about work. Even at the best of times, it hadn't been the most fulfilling job in the world, but these days my cubicle felt like a tomb. My job was to call people who had filled out negative reviews for the phone company. I'm sure you know which one, but it's probably best to leave that unsaid, and ask why. This was a doubly depressing task because it was both never-ending and pointless. How many times in the past month have you picked up a call from a number you didn't recognize? I'm guessing the answer is lower than 1. Almost nobody picked up, and those who did invariably did one of two things: hang up instantly upon realizing who I was, or scream invective at me that I would hesitate before repeating to the devil himself. One particularly creative gentleman suggested I fold myself in half 17 times to create a black hole and then have intercourse with said hole while my company's headquarters were sucked into the event horizon. Points for creativity. Deductions for misogyny. Although, in fairness to the man, I have no trouble believing he'd have said something similar to a male rep. That day only 2 people picked up. One hung up immediately. The other launched into a tirade of such intensity and fervor that I was worried he wouldn't make it to the end of the call. And another thing, the man shouted as I quietly ate a sandwich on the other end. Your website looks like it was designed by some rock monkey with shit for brains and feet for hands, he screamed at me. This was an insult I hadn't heard before. Variations on it appeared with some regularity, sometimes with racial overtones. I'm not entirely sure why this was, given that I had no accent identifying me as anything other than white, and in fact I wasn't. The assumption seemed to be that because I worked in customer service I must be Indian. This leap in logic went unquestioned by a surprising number of my interlocutors. The average consumer of cellular services in this country is a few rocks short of an avalanche themselves. I'm sorry that our services did not meet your quality and reliability expectations, I said dryly, reading from the part of the script labeled negative responses. And I'm sorry that you people haven't gone back to where you come from, the man shouted. I'm from Omaha, sir, I said. Where you're really from, he shouted back. I'm really from Omaha, sir, I responded tiredly. And so is my father and his father, and before that we came over from England. This prompted a string of racial epithets I'd rather not repeat. The rest of the day went like this, and after a while I defaulted to flatly repeating I'm sorry that our services did not meet your quality and reliability expectations. My faith in humanity dimmed with each passing call. I decided to slip out at 4 o'clock. I figured no one would notice. I figured right. It was Wednesday, trash day. The walk from my apartment to the dumpsters was a dismal affair. Despite gray skies, cold fog and a pounding headache, the excursion did at least deliver the best part of my day. A few guys catcalled me on the way to the curb, and for a moment I felt like something other than a disgusting blob of flesh. But then the thoughts started back in and made me realize that the men's comments had not been compliments but acts of aggression. As I dragged the empty trash cans back to my apartment, the men once more yelled out their opinions on my face, my tits, my ass. In response, my mind conjured scenes from my dream: melted flesh, the endless unanswerable question, why didn't you save me, Mama? By the time I'd made it back to my apartment, I was practically in tears. At that moment, however, I remembered that the doll had been delivered earlier. It was time, I supposed, to open it. After a few unsuccessful attempts, the package yielded its contents, and I nearly fell over when I saw it for the first time. It looked exactly like Sarah. Her little, premature hands. Her closed, screwed up eyes. Everything. I held the tiny plastic facsimile against my chest and sobbed into it. I apologized to it over and over again. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm so sorry. But nothing could have prepared me for the moment that it spoke back. Why didn't you save me, Mama? I screamed and fell backwards. The floor flew up to meet me and struck the back of my head with overwhelming force, driving the tears out even faster through a combination of momentum and pain. What did you say? I asked, with a shaking voice. For a moment, the doll was quiet, its little eyes still shut against the world. Then, they snapped open. Its little mouth opened and flopped around like a fish before repeating, "Why didn't you save me, Mama?" I threw it across the room. It was an instinct, but a second later, I felt bad. It was like seeing Sarah's death all over again. The doll screamed and cried. "Why did you hurt me, Mama?" It asked in its sad, childlike voice. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. I threw up again and again, my body shaking uncontrollably. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. That thing was nothing more than a hunk of colored plastic. When there was nothing left to expel from my stomach except bile, I returned to the front room and slowly approached the doll where it lay in the corner. Its eyes snapped to mine. "Why did you leave me, Mama?" I picked it up and hurled it out the window. For a moment, I thought that I should try and call the short Russian man who had sold me the monstrosity, but then I remembered that it was 8:30 on a Wednesday. Not even Russians have that kind of work ethic. Instead, I poured a glass of wine with shaking fingers and turned on the TV, desperate for something, anything to break the silence. As the news blared and the alcohol entered my veins, I was almost able to convince myself that the last few minutes hadn't happened. But then the screen began flashing images of babies in incubators, victims of some war halfway around the world. Protesters marched through the streets, holding images of the poor, malnourished infants, and listing out those they felt were responsible. Before I turned it off, I could have sworn that one of them turned to the screen and said my name. When I did fall asleep, it was only after many hours of crying and shaking. As returned the silence, so returned my certainty that I had heard the doll speaking. But human frailty won the day, and my brain surrendered to darkness once more. In my dream, I saw Tim holding little Sarah and crying. He held her close and put the tiny baby girl to his face, kissing her again and again. Then he turned to me with an eyeless face and spoke with a toothless mouth. "Why didn't you save her, Mary?" I tried to scream, but in this world I could not make a sound. My mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, and I felt like I was breathing in the ocean. Then, little Sarah looked at me with her little melting face and said, "Didn't you love me, Mama?" When I didn't answer, the tiny melted eyes burned with rage. "I hate you, Mama. Everybody hates you. You throw me out the window. You should jump out yourself and do the world a favor, you worthless sack of human garbage forgotten by God. Why are you even alive, you heartless bitch?" I kept trying to scream, but nothing would come out. I tried to apologize but could only feel the sensation of water rushing into my lungs. Sarah began to say, over and over, "Why didn't you save me, Mama? Why didn't you save me, Mama? Why didn't you save me?" I woke with a start to find the doll inches from my face. It was shouting at me. "Why didn't you save me, Mama?" This time, I did scream, and batted it away from my face. The horrible thing, which somehow had reappeared in my house after I'd thrown it out of a 7th-story window, began to sob in the corner where it fell. It looked up at me with its tiny heartbroken eyes and quivering lips as it asked me, "Why did you hurt me, Mama? Do you hate me?" Without thinking, I said, "Of course I don't hate you, sweetie. Mommy loves you very much." I froze. What was I doing? This thing wasn't Sarah. It wasn't even a person. Then why did you hurt me, Mama? Why didn't you save me? I buried my head in my hands. I couldn't save you. I'm sorry. The tears continued to pour from my eyes in rivers, soaking the arms of my shirt. You didn't deserve me, Mama. You cold-hearted cunt. You shouldn't even be alive. I looked at the thing in shock. Hearing those words in a child's voice was somehow far worse. It couldn't stay in my house. Not 1 second longer. But throwing it out the window hadn't worked, so I had to come up with another plan. I grabbed the hateful thing and carried it to the fireplace. It screamed all the while, sobbing just like a child in pain. Don't burn me, Mama. Don't hurt me. Why are you doing this? I was undeterred. The fire roared to life, and I hurled it into the hottest part of the blaze as it hurled insults back at me. Nobody's ever loved you. Why do you think Tim left, you stupid bitch? If he really loved you, he'd have stayed. Slowly but surely, the thing melted in the flames. Its little face turned to mush, then to liquid, then to ash. The smell was atrocious, but at least it was gone. I lay panting on the floor, crying but relieved. Later, I called the Russian man and told him that something was terribly wrong with his doll. He listened to my story, then said, not without empathy, "Maybe you should go back to this doctor? The one who referred you here." It was the most polite way that someone had ever called me crazy. Seeing that this was a mistake, somewhat too late to avoid it, unfortunately, I hung up. Work was no better than it had been the day before. I listened as people berated me over the phone, and read from my script in a monotone voice. I was no more useful than a robot. As the insults went on and on, I began to dissociate from my body. My mouth said the words in the script, but my brain had no say in the matter. The words simply spilled from me like tears from my eyes. At lunch, I sat next to Jim. I'd always liked Jim. Had a huge crush on him since the day we'd met. Normally, we took our lunch breaks at different times, but that day the stars aligned. The biggest problem with talking to Jim had always been that we had zero interests in common. But that day, the TV in the break room happened to flip to a channel playing a soccer match. We discovered that we were both huge fans, and finally I had something I could say to him. Things couldn't have been going better until I looked down and saw, under the table, something that made me jump a foot in the air. The doll. It was staring up at me with its cold eyes and sneering mouth. "You can't get rid of me, Mama. No matter how much you want to." Jim looked at me strangely, and I apologized, making some half-hearted excuse that I probably wouldn't have believed coming from him. "What makes you think he'd be interested in someone like you? Have you looked in a mirror sometime this decade? Unless he's got a corpse fetish, I'd say you're about 2 decades too old for him." I stared down at the doll so long, Jim asked me what was going on. I picked it up, and showed him. When he asked what it was, I hesitated before answering. Eventually, I lied and said that it was a present for my daughter. "I didn't know you had a daughter," Jim said. "Yeah, I gave birth a couple of months ago," I replied, which was not technically a lie. "Of course it's a lie, you worthless bitch." If you told him the truth, he'd run screaming into the street. The only reason he's stuck around this long is because there's only one break room. Nobody will ever love you. Nobody. Stop it!" I yelled, before remembering that Jim had no idea what this thing was. He looked at me strangely and I bolted out of the room, sobbing and cursing the malevolent presence in my arms. It cursed me right back. "What the fuck's wrong with you? Why would you even talk to him? You're a disgusting pile of shit and vomit unworthy of life. You know what you could do to make Jim's life better? You could slam your fucking head through a plate glass window and spray the side of the building with blood until you fucking die. Stop it!" I shouted, and threw it onto the floor as I ran to my car. But, there it was inside, waiting for me, its hateful sneer plastered onto its tiny, childlike face. "What's the matter, Mary? Can't handle the truth? Can't handle knowing that you're a failure as a mother and the ugliest bitch who ever lived?" I sank to my knees and screamed, holding my head with both hands and begging the hateful thing to stop. But it didn't. It kept pummeling me with insults and threats until I couldn't take it 1 second longer. I got into the driver's seat and floored the accelerator, taking the car onto the freeway, then to the nearest exit, then right off the edge of a cliff. As the car soared through the air, there was a tiny moment of quiet before gravity took over. It was only an instant, but in that instant I realized that I was going to die. So for the first time in weeks, I smiled. The next thing I can remember is tremendous pain. My eyes hadn't even opened yet, but even though the world was dark, it was still full of suffering. Then, in the next instant, my eyes flew open. There, at the edge of the bed, looking at me with all the hate in the world, was a familiar hateful face. "Welcome back to the land of the living, bitch. Couldn't even get suicide right, could you?" I had no energy left to sob. Instead, I hung my head in defeat, looking at the tiny hunk of plastic staring up at me and wishing to God that I'd chosen a higher cliff. Soon, a man in a white lab coat walked in and smiled. "Hello Mary," he said. "How do you know my name?" I asked. "They checked your wallet when they pulled you out of the car. Your driver's license was right on top," he replied, still smiling. "Right," I said, not smiling back. "I'm not going to lie to you, that was a close call there. But you're going to be okay. Would you mind answering a few questions?" I immediately became wary, but nodded my head. "Before the accident, do you recall feeling lightheaded or dizzy?" I shook my head. "Any alcohol or drug use?" I shook my head. "Okay, good. And have you had any thoughts of hurting yourself in the past week?" This was the question I'd been waiting for. I shook my head again, knowing that an affirmative answer would mean at least a 3-day psychiatric hold. As soon as they learned about the doll, God knows how long it'd last. "Excellent. You should be able to get out of here in a couple of days. You'll have to be careful with those casts, but everything will be okay." I nodded again, and he left. The doll popped its little face back off the bed sheets and set itself right back to its task, destroying my mind and soul. As the night wore on, I sat there, frozen, as it continued to pound me with reminders of my inadequacies, my faults, my failures. From time to time, I had to stand and it stood with me, clinging to my hospital gown as I made my way to the bathroom, to the cafeteria, or to have one test or another performed. From that moment on, it was never quiet, though I seemed to be the only one who could hear it. Whether it was reminding me of that time in 3rd grade when Johnny Welkins had rejected me in front of the entire class, or the time that I'd sat through an entire date before realizing my shirt was on inside out, or berating me about letting the original Sarah die, it was always saying something degrading and humiliating. By then, I'd become numb to the abuse. I never responded or argued. I never fought back or tried to get rid of it. Once or twice, I accidentally crushed it under my foot, but it always ended up right back where it had started, on my hospital bed, eyes burning with rage and lips firing off insult after insult. The last night I was in the hospital, I dreamt of Tim. I dreamt of the last time that I'd seen him before he disappeared forever. He stood in the doorway, blocking it with a stern face and large hands. I kept trying to push past him, but he wouldn't let me. Eventually, we fought, and he threw me to the floor. I landed on my stomach so hard all the air flew out of my lungs. When I woke, the doll was standing over me, and it had gone back to its familiar mantra. "Why didn't you save me, Mama? Why didn't you save me, Mama?" I sighed and focused on filling out the discharge forms that the nurse had left. They were long and boring, and it was no simple task to complete them with the doll repeating its horrible question again and again and again. Eventually, I finished, and an orderly wheeled me out to my car, the doll clinging to my shoulder and shouting abuse into my ear. A single tear fell from my eye and rolled down my cheek as I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. When I arrived home, I collapsed on my bed and began to weep. I wept like a child. I wept so loud in fact that I couldn't even hear the doll as it broke down my door and resumed berating me. But I ignored it. I ignored it as I made dinner. I ignored it as I took out the trash. I ignored it as I returned to bed and tried to sleep. But it wouldn't stop. Finally, it got close to my face and screamed right into my ear. "Why didn't you save me, Mama? Why didn't you save me, Mama?" And, for the first time since the accident, I replied, shouting, "What do you want from me? I couldn't save you, Sarah. I couldn't." "Liar. You could have saved me. You know you could have." In that instant, it finally pushed me past my breaking point. I picked it up and shook it as hard as I could, screaming, "What could I have done? What was I supposed to do? What do you want from me? Why are you doing this to me?" The doll looked at me with cold, hateful eyes and said, "You could have stopped him." I froze. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You know what I mean, Mama. You know what he did. Why didn't you stand up to him? Why didn't you stop him?" "I don't know what you're talking about," I shouted. "Yes you do. You know exactly what I'm talking about." "No," I shouted. "No, I couldn't stop him." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie. We both know why the stillbirth really happened, don't we, Mary? I shook uncontrollably and ran into the backyard to get away from the doll, but it only appeared right in front of me, scowling down at me as I tripped and fell. It pointed to the ground and began to raise its little arms. The ground shook and trembled and I shouted at it, begged it to stop, but it was too late. In one enormous burst the ground split open and a body fell next to me. It was Tim. "Why didn't you save me from him, Mary?" the doll asked. I continued sobbing, but managed to respond, "I couldn't save you, Sarah. But I could get you justice." The doll's face softened a little, and for the first time, the fire went out of its eyes. It crawled up next to me and buried its little face into my chest, and let me hold it, just like I'd always wanted to do. I stroked its hair and whispered to it, over and over again, "I would have saved you if I could." And in its tiny, childlike voice, the doll replied, "I know." Then it closed its little eyes, nuzzled close into my chest, and heaved a heavy sigh before never moving again.